Well, hey, good morning, everyone. Hey, we've been going through this series throughout most of the summer, and I think we're on like about week 10 or so now. And what I wanted to do before we head into the text that we're going to focus on today, I thought it'd be good to give us a bit of a recap, because I know we can kind of treat sermons, we can kind of compartmentalize them, kind of forget and move on to the next one. And so I thought I would do just a skim the top of the waves thing of what John has been talking about in this letter so far. And so even though he's got a lot of different themes that come up during his letter, there are really two themes that rise to the top that are like the predominant themes that he talks about throughout this letter. The first one is that we should abide in God's light. He says this over and over and over, that we should be abiding in God's light. If we're a follower of Jesus, we should be abiding in his light. And John, almost more than any other author in the scriptures, he has this image that he gives to us when it comes to sin and holiness, that sin is often portrayed as darkness in the scriptures, and holiness is often portrayed as light. And so John is encouraging us to abide in God's light and to not live in darkness. And he makes the case throughout all of his writings that we're able to do that because of what Jesus has done for us. Because of Jesus' birth, that he entered into the world with us, that he had a life and a ministry that he taught to us, and that he died on the cross for us, and he was resurrected. And because of that, then we no longer have to walk in darkness and in guilt and in shame and sin. But we can actually walk in his light, that we can actually do that. And what does that even mean? Well, what does light do? Light exposes things, right? I love the way that the Psalms talk about this. In Psalm 119, it's a famous psalm that says, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." So in other words, it's a lamp to my feet. It's showing me where I am right now. It's revealing things about me, good and bad. It's revealing things about my life and about my soul and about my faith. But it doesn't just leave me there if there's something wrong. It doesn't just point things out and say, look how wrong you are. It's a light to my path. It gives me a way forward. It gives me next steps to take. So his word, in regards to that, his word is a lamp to our feet. It exposes where we are, and it also shows us where we need to go. That's what light does. It shows us who we really are. It shows us where we need to go. The second theme that John has here in his letter is that we should abide in God's love. You've probably seen this over and over again in his letter as we've gone through it. And really, if you think about love and you think about the Bible, I bet for most folks, your mind goes towards 1 Corinthians 13, right? Because that's the chapter of love. That's what we hear every time we go to a wedding. Somebody talks about 1 Corinthians 13. And there's a reason for that, because what that chapter does is that chapter describes what love is, right? We know that passage probably a little bit. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is enduring. And that passage, it talks about what love is, but John drills even more into it. And he doesn't just tell us what love is, he says who love is. Listen to what he says here in 1 John 4. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." So he doesn't just tell us that God has love like we would have love towards somebody. He says he's the very essence of love. He is love. And then John goes on to say that if we are abiding in his light and we are abiding in his love as followers of Jesus, there should be some evidence in our life. There should be some way that our neighbors and our coworkers and our families, they can see that in our lives. This is what he says in 1 John 2. He says, "Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." And now think about the way that Jesus walked through this life. He talked differently to people. He talked differently about people. He loved differently than others loved. He saw the people that society would toss to the side, and he would embrace them and he would care for them. He would see the things that the world placed a high value on, and he would barely have any regard for it. He walked through this world very differently than the rest of the world. It was very countercultural to how the rest of the world walked. And so John is saying that if we are abiding in his light, if we're abiding in his love, if we're close to Jesus, then there should be evidence. And he uses this phrase over and over. He uses this phrase, "by this we know." In other words, by this we know that we are following Jesus. And there's a few of them. By this we know because we keep his commandments. By this we know because we have the Holy Spirit in our lives. By this we know because we don't settle into the regular rhythm of sin. By this we know because we love the brothers. That's this kind of generic term for the church, that we love each other inside of the church. By this we know that we're following Jesus, and there's evidence that people can see in our lives. So just take that in for a moment, that John is saying that if we're abiding in his light, we're abiding in his love, that we should be walking like Jesus walked. That people should be able to look at us as followers of Jesus and see similar things in our lives, that we speak differently, that we love differently, that we care for people differently, that we're not dictated just by the ways of the culture, but we stand firm on what God tells us to stand firm on. And so as we turn into chapter 5, John's final chapter here in 1 John, he's going to talk a little bit about what this looks like, and he's going to make some statements about what it looks like to follow God, what it looks like to love God, and he opens this door for something that maybe is a little uncomfortable. So let me just read 1 John 5, and then we'll break it down. So in 1 John 5, this is what he says. He says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God. And everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of him. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? So what John is talking about here, what he's proposing here, is this same myth that maybe you've seen him touch on throughout the letter, this myth that you can say something is true and then live your life as though that thing is not true. That you can say something is true and then live your life as though that thing is not true. So you can say that you're a good driver, but if you have a lot of tickets, right? You can say that you're a hard worker, but if the projects never get done, you could say you're really good with money, but if you're under a mountain of debt, you see, we can say a lot of things are true, but it doesn't make them true. We can say a lot of things are true, it doesn't necessarily make them true, and that's the myth that John is talking about here. He says you can't say that you love God and then not have love for his children. And you can't say that you love God and have no regard for his commandments. And then John makes a statement in here, and maybe it's a passing statement, maybe you didn't even notice it as he went along. But he says this about the commandments. He says his commandments are not burdensome. And I think out of all that, that's the thing that stands out to me the most, because I think that if we were all honest with each other, I don't know if we'd always talk about commandments that way. That, oh yeah, God's commandments, they're not a burden. They're actually pretty easy, right? We have a struggle with commandments. We have a long-standing, complicated history that goes all the way back to the garden, where two confusing simultaneously things happened. Where one, we were convinced that his commandments are too hard to keep. And at the same time, we were convinced that his commandments were too hard not to keep. Confusing, right? Yeah, let's talk about that, because that's the tension that we tend to live in when it comes to God's commandments. And so this idea that they're too hard to keep, it goes all the way back to the garden, to our original parents, to Adam and Eve, when they were deceived into thinking that God's commandments, they didn't really matter that much. They didn't really matter. Back then, there was only one commandment. If you know that story, right, God creates everything. He creates the entire world for these people, for us. And he creates a special place inside of that world called Eden, and he allows them to exist inside of there. And he says the entire world and everything in it is yours to enjoy. But I have set up a boundary for your good around this one tree. You've got the entire world to enjoy, the entire garden to eat from and enjoy. But I have set up a boundary around this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for your good, for your benefit. And they were deceived into thinking that beyond that boundary, there was some sort of good, there was some sort of pleasure, there was some sort of joy, there was some sort of thing that would make them more complete. And they crossed that boundary. We know that story. They cross the boundary. They break the commandment that God has given. That's one commandment that they have been given. And we all know what that feels like now, because that's the day that rebellion entered into the human heart. Rebellion entered into the human heart, where we have this idea that his commandments are too hard to keep, and so we'll often cross the line. And that rebellion, it's something, I don't think I need to stand up here and convince you that that's true, that we're rebellious in our hearts against rules and commandments and boundaries, not even when it comes to just God, but boundaries and rules in general. We are rule breakers. We like to push against the boundaries. It's because we've inherited that all the way down from Adam and Eve, all the way down through every generation, to your grandparents, to your parents, and to you. And if you have kids now, you know that you've passed it on, because you know and you see rebellion in your kids, right? My youngest son, Judah, is like a walking, talking illustration of this right now. He's 3.5 years old. And obviously, as dad, I've got boundaries. I've got rules in place for his good because I love him. Don't touch the stove. Don't touch sharp things, right? Well, this week I was in my office. I have an office downstairs in our basement, in our family room, and the best way to get to our backyard is through that area. And like a lot of basements, we have a dehumidifier, and it's right by the door. And that dehumidifier, it's got buttons. It beeps when you push them. It's got lights. It's the coolest thing in the world for a 3.5-year-old. It's his biggest temptation in life, this dehumidifier. And so when he comes in, he gives me that little eye, and I know what he's thinking. And so I say, Judah, don't touch the dehumidifier. And do you know what that little stinker does? He makes direct eye contact with me, and he goes. So I have to get a little bit more stern. Judah, don't touch that dehumidifier. And he keeps getting closer and closer. And his hand raises up, and then instantly he'll just kind of change tactics, and he'll go. Because he's kind of, he's skirting the rules. Technically, he didn't touch it. His shoe touched it. And so that's his biggest temptation in life. And he loves to push those buttons. And there are some times where I'll come down to my office and I'll realize he's been there, because as soon as I walk in with the first breath, instantly all the moisture is sucked out of my face, because he's figured out some sort of high turbo mode on this dehumidifier. It's just because there's a boundary around that thing. He loves to cross it. He loves to touch it. He loves to push against it. And it's one of those things where, when kids are pushing on those boundaries, it's kind of funny. You try not to laugh. But the reality is when I sit there and I see him do that, I know what that is, because I see it in myself so much. I've seen it in myself so many times over the years, where I know that God has a boundary for me. He has a rule in place, a commandment in place that is put there for my own good, even if I don't understand it. And what do? I inch up towards it to see how close I can get to it, to see what he's going to do, to see what the reaction is. And it's almost like I'm making this blatant eye contact with him as I step over to break that rule. And that's something that is built into all of us. It's not just us when we're kids. It's not something that grows out of us. As we get older, it just changes forms, and we get more adept at being able to excuse it away. We are folks who push against rules. And I know I'm not the only one that's like that. Probably at home, right? At home, that's where mom and dad makes all the rules. And so what do we do as teenagers? We push against the rules, right? Because mom and dad, they're old. And those rules, they may have applied back when, they were riding horse and buggies around, but those don't apply now. So mom and dad, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about. And so what do? We push against the rules. It's built into us. Maybe for you, it's at work, because she should have never been promoted to manager. And now all the rules that she's making, they don't make any sense. And I wouldn't do it this way. And so why should I follow this? She doesn't know what she's talking about. Or maybe it's at school. School is the place where, there are all the boundaries and there are all the rules in place. But you see all your peers push against those boundaries. And so to fit in, you do it as well. You see, we're folks that are pushing against the boundaries constantly, because it's something inside of us. It's something that we've inherited. Just like you have inherited the shape of your nose, or the color of your hair, or the height that you have. You inherit physical traits. You've also inherited a spiritual trait called sin. And it's this rebellious heart that is inside of all of us. And so we have this really complicated history with commandments, because we want to push against them. We've been convinced that they're too hard to keep. But this is where it gets really confusing. because at the same time, we're also convinced that they're too hard not to keep. Let me explain what I mean. So many years after the garden, God, his nation has now grown, and he gives them laws. He gives them commandments to flourish, to be able to operate as a society for a couple reasons, but some of the main reasons is that they can be in his presence, they can enjoy him, they can be in community with one another, but also so that they can be a blessing to the nations around them. But that's not what they did with the law. That's not what they did with his commandments. They took it and they turned it into something else. They took these rules, these laws, these boundaries, and they made them oppressive, and they made them a burden on people. And we know this because we see that played out all through the Old Testament. And then when Jesus begins his ministry, he begins to call this out. In fact, some of his most critical words are for the religious leaders that are placing burdens on people's backs. Listen to this account in Matthew where he's teaching his disciples. He said, then Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples, the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So that's a place of authority, is what he's saying. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but so not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. So he's calling out the hypocrisy. He's saying, do what they teach you from the law because it's from God, but don't follow after them and don't do what they do because they're not actually practicing it themselves. And what they're doing is they're laying heavy burdens on. And Jesus uses this idea of laying heavy burdens on their shoulders. It's this image of how the rabbis would teach back then. And so whether you had a scribe or a Pharisee or a Sadducee considered a rabbi, a teacher, they would have disciples that would follow them. And each rabbi's interpretation of those laws and commandments would be attractive to a certain disciple. So for example, if this rabbi so-and-so, he had a certain view on the Sabbath or on justice or on marriage, you would follow him. And maybe this rabbi had a different view on the Sabbath or on justice issues or marriage, and so somebody else would follow him. And their individual interpretation of God's law would be known as the yoke, this thing that they would take on. In other words, it's an image of like an oxen wearing this instrument of submission, saying that I'm willing to take on your teaching and follow after you. And Jesus says these burdens that you're putting on people, these extra rules, these extra laws, they're not helping people who are trying to find God. They're weighing them down. They're weighing them down, and plus you're not even following them yourself. And so he calls out these religious leaders. And you see, that's the thing. Like there have been different numbers of tallies of how many laws are actually in the Old Testament over the years. 613 seems to be kind of a consensus of numbers that was picked years ago. But it's not necessarily the laws themselves, it's the interpretations of those laws. It's the rules that they put on the rules. It's the rules they put on the rules, where they weighed people down. Let me give you kind of an example so I don't necessarily lose this here. There were certain rabbis that would outline how many steps you were allowed to take on the Sabbath before you actually broke the Sabbath law. You only had a certain number of steps that you were allowed to take, and if you got to that number of steps, you had to stop and sit down and wait for sundown so the day would reset. That's not in the Bible, by the way. It's like they were like an opposite of a watch, right? Your watch now tells you need to do more steps today. They were like the opposite of that, saying like, guys, slow down. You got to sit down and stop. So you had a certain number of steps you were allowed to take on the Sabbath before you broke God's law, and you made God angry, is what they would tell you. And that's not how any of this works. So when Jesus is talking about them laying heavy burdens on the back of people who are trying to find God, this is what he's talking about, that they've taken the law and they've turned it into something else. They've turned it into a burden when it was meant to be a blessing. And here's what I know. Like, I don't need Pharisees and scribes. I don't need some external group of people in my life telling me how I don't live up to God's rules and laws and commands. Like, I do that on my own. I know that I am not good at keeping all of God's commands. I don't need anybody else to tell me that. And so I struggle with this idea of like, I want to keep them, but I can't keep them. I'm not good at keeping them. I break them. You break them. We all do. And it's this struggle, this tension that we're in between often, where we think they're too hard to keep, but they're also too hard not to keep, because we're stuck between this rebellious heart that has come out of the garden and this religious obligation that was born out of this idea that we could climb a ladder and we could get to God and we could earn his favor. So we're stuck between a rebellious heart and religious obligation. And that's the tension that so many of us live in. And it's not even like one or the other. It's a daily thing where in the morning you may think, God, who are you to tell me what to do? And we push against the boundary. And we think there's some sort of pleasure or some sort of gain or some sort of thing that he's holding back from us on the other side of that command. And so we cross the line because everybody else does. And then instantly we feel what we've done and we say, God, okay, I'm going to try harder. I'm going to do better. And by lunchtime, we've broken that too. Like, we are people that are torn in between these two entities. This idea of a rebellious heart and religious obligation. And it is a constant struggle. Do you feel that struggle? That tension of trying to keep God's commands and this rebellious heart that wants to break them? If you do, you're not alone, because I think we all feel it. Like, I don't know if we're all going to nod our heads right now, but the reality is we all feel it, and we've felt it since the garden. The Apostle Paul, who was a contemporary of John's, he writes in his letter to the Romans, the book of Romans, he writes about this tension, and I think it's captured so well in the Message version of that letter. This is in Romans 7. I want you to hear how Paul describes this and see if maybe this is what you feel. He's talking about this tension, and he says, I need something more. For if I know the law, but still can't keep it, and if the power of sin within me keeps sabotaging my best intentions, I obviously need help. I realize that I don't have what it takes. I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad, but then I do it anyway. My decisions, such as they are, they don't result in actions. Something has gone wrong deep within me, and it gets the better of me every time. It happens so regularly that it's predictable. The moment that I decide to do good, sin is there to trip me up. I truly delight in God's commandments, but it's pretty obvious that not all of me joins in that delight. Parts of me covertly rebel, and just when I least expect it, they take charge. I've tried everything, and nothing helps. I'm at the end of my rope. Is there no one who can do anything for me? He says, isn't that the real question? See, what Paul is describing is that tension between a religious heart, or a religious obligation and a rebellious heart. He's describing that tension that we all feel when it comes to God's commands. If we decide not to keep them, they're a burden. If we decide to try harder to keep them, they're a burden. That's the tension that he's describing. He captures it so well. So what do we do with these kind of commandments that are too hard to keep and too hard not to keep, where we're stuck in this complicated, hard to understand middle ground between these things? What do we do? Well, notice what Paul's conclusion was here. He didn't say, what do I have to do? Where can I try harder? He didn't say, how can I fix this? With his conclusion, he lands on this question, who is going to help me? Who can rescue me? Who can save me from this heart that is torn in two, that is so complex and so hard to navigate? Who's going to rescue me from this? And I love Paul's response. In the very next sentence, he simply says, thank God for Jesus. Thank God for Jesus. Because if we live in that tension without him, we are lost. There is no hope. We will never be able to keep his commandments enough to make God happy, and we will never be able to rebel against enough to prove ourselves, whatever that may look like. Thank God for Jesus. Paul has come to this realization, you can almost kind of hear it in here. He's come to this realization that he's tried all these things before. He's tried to self-fix in many ways. He tried to keep the law. But he comes to this realization that the darkness inside of him, the rebellion inside of him, this inconsistent, torn apart heart inside of him is nothing that he can fix. Only Jesus can fix this. Only Jesus can step in and fix this. And so here's what I want to do. I want to take a moment, maybe do something a little bit different than we normally do in a sermon, but I want us to kind of process this, because I just gave you two kind of heavy things, this idea that you can't keep the law and you can't not keep the law. I want us all, no matter where you are at any location, I want you to just close your eyes. Kind of in a posture of prayer right now, I want you to close your eyes. Just kind of let the world around you fade away for a moment. Just take a deep breath. Maybe consider that tension that we all feel, that tension that we often break God's law because we're rebellious. And we often go against his law because we're trying really hard and leaving him out of the equation. Just feel that tension for a moment. Feel the heaviness that places on your shoulders. And now I want to read some words to you. With your eyes closed, I still want you to process this. I want to read some words to you that they're the words of Jesus. He says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Let me read that again. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Okay, you can open your eyes. So given all that tension that we all know is inside of our heart, isn't there something refreshing about hearing the words of Jesus? Isn't there something refreshing about hearing him talk about his heart towards us? You see, that's what I have learned since I began following Jesus in my 20s, is that the more I know the heart of the one who's giving the commands, the more willing I am to understand them, to dig into them, to obey them even when I don't understand them. The more I know the heart behind what is being commanded of me, the more willing I am to dig in deep. That's where John was. John begins his letter by saying, this is something that I saw with my own eyes, that I experienced with my own life. And yeah, I'll follow Jesus anywhere. Why? Not because his commandments are just this list of rules that are floating out there that I have to do out of some sort of religious obligation, but because I know his heart. I saw him do this. I saw him care for people, and so I will follow him anywhere. I'll do whatever he asks me to do because he's the God of the universe who decided to become flesh and come and rescue us. Do you know why I give Judah and all of my kids rules and boundaries? We could even call them commandments at times. Do you know why I do that? Because I love them. And I want them to be safe, and I want them to grow, and I want them to learn and become mature adults that will also go out into this world and abide in God's light and abide in God's love and be someone who changes the world in their circle of influence. I put these rules in place because I love them, not because I'm harsh or I'm a taskmaster trying to steer them the way that I want them to go. And you see, the more we get to know the heart of the ones who's giving us the commands, the more likely we are to follow these commands. The more likely we're able to step out in faith and say, yes, God, I know that you command me to be pure, sexually pure in my relationships. And so even though the rest of the world does something completely different, I'm going to trust you. And I'm going to step out and try this command because I know your heart for me. Yes, Lord, I know that you command us to be humble. And even though the rest of the world really tries to elevate pridefulness, I'm going to try this, and I'm going to step out, and I'm going to try humility. And even though the rest of the world talks about getting and having your own and buying the best things, I'm going to step out. I'm going to try generosity because I see all those things in Jesus. He was a generous God who came to earth to be with us. He was a humble God who came to earth and gave away so much of himself for us. We can look at every command that's in the scriptures and we can see Jesus do it first. And so the closer we are to him, the more likely you are to know the heart of the one who's giving the commands to us, and we're willing to try those things. But here's what I have seen over so many years of ministry. I think that so many people live their lives and operate in a way that we're hoping that God's commands will change, that they won't be so restrictive, that they won't be so countercultural. But the reality is the commandments will never change. God says that himself. And it's not the commandments that need to change whenever you're looking to make them not a burden. It's you. You see, we're the ones that need to change. The commandments will not change. And the way that we do that is not to try harder, but it's to get closer and closer to the one who gives the commands so that our hearts are changed. It's what Jesus talks about when he mentions in John's gospel about being born again. We don't just need new commandments. We don't just need to try harder. We need a completely new heart to follow after him. And so the closer we get to the one who is giving us these commands, the more we know his heart, that gentle and lowly heart that he himself describes, the more likely we are to begin to keep his commands, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Because we're walking through life in his light and in his love, and out of a thankfulness for him and what he has done for us, we say, yes, God, we will keep your commandments. And that's how we're going to show our love to you and for what you've done. Let me pray for us. So, Father, we thank you for the richness of your word, always. We thank you that in your word you have defined things for us. You have created boundaries. You have given commandments for our good, to help us to flourish, to help us to be a blessing to others. We thank you that as a father, you're invested in our lives enough to put these boundaries in place because you care for us. We're thankful that you cared for us enough to send your son, the greatest gift we could ever have, to send your son to live among us, to die on the cross for our sins, and to set an example for us of what it looks like to keep these commandments and stay connected to you. So Lord, may we not try harder in any of this, but simply be closer to Jesus, closer to the one who, in your word, which we read earlier, is love. And he is light. So may we abide in his light and abide in his love by being closer to him. Thank you, Jesus, for all that you are to us. We love you and we praise you, and it's in your name. Amen.